If your business has pivoted 3 or 4 times, that's not strategy. That's a symptom. And it usually means you don't know what you're doing. Okay. Again, another taboo topic. I'm just going to say what I've seen over the last 12 years of doing business operations. So stick around if you want to know what I really think about all this. So there's a difference between pivoting, over pivoting, hard pivots, and soft pivots in business. A pivot is a strategic shift based on validated market insight. So it could be your business model, it could be your strategy, it could be the messaging, it could be your branding, it could be even certain features in your product. Basically, it means you're changing your mind. So let's start with hard pivoting. Hard pivoting means that you're just changing your direction drastically. It could be that you're hard pivoting your customer base. It could be that you're hard pivoting your product to fit your customers better. Whatever it is, it's a massive change to the way folks have already been perceiving your product, service, or business. Light pivots, on the other hand, are slight adjustments to the messaging, to the branding, maybe small features within the product or service. These are usually non-drastic adjustments. Not everyone in your existing customer base would fully realize that there's a pivot that has been made by the company. Okay, maybe this is just my own terminology, but my concept of over pivoting is that you've just pivoted too many times. It could be a bunch of light pivots, or it could be, in I guess the worst case scenario, is a bunch of hard pivots. Over pivoting means that you've been changing directions too many times, right? You can get away with this at when you're doing light pivots because your customer might not necessarily tell if you've changed or upgraded your messaging and what have you. But over pivoting hard all the time means that there's a fundamental unclarity and miscalculation and misjudgment towards how you perceive your product should fit and be delivered to your customers. There are plenty of cases you might have seen where pivoting makes sense and it turned out to be successful. There are many YouTube videos of founders who've made a hard pivot and have turned out to be very successful. So this video is a little bit taboo in a sense that a lot of the content on YouTube glorifies when pivots have become successful, right? There's a million and one stories of a founder or a business going one direction and changed a major feature or changed their customer base or changed their branding drastically. And then boom, they hit their next revenue goals and scaled, et cetera, et cetera. But after doing business operations for 12 years across 50 different companies, I've seen a lot of pivoting, especially a lot of over pivoting. And I want to talk today about why it should not be glorified the way it is. My opinion is that over pivoting is something dangerous. It's dangerous because the concept of over pivoting, meaning that you're changing directions too many times, signals the lack of clarity and focus you need in order for the business to run smoothly. So, why is over pivoting so dangerous? Well, you can't build solid business foundations if the ground is constantly moving, right? So if you're trying to scale up your business operations and there's nothing streamlined and consistent, everything is changing all the time. It's very hard to deploy these changes company wide every so often, right? You have to deploy the messaging from the director level all the way down to the frontline staff. There's just so much information that needs to be mentioned to each one of your team members if you're constantly changing. It gets confusing for employees in the entire organization to keep up with all of those micro adjustments because a small change has massive ripple effects. Fulfillment, ops, hiring, marketing, sales. Think about it. If you have a micro pivot happening right now and you only tell your next in line. Let's say it's your chief marketing officer. Well, the chief marketing officer needs to deploy this information, let the team know of these micro pivots. Perhaps it's the messaging. And then let's say sales team didn't get exactly that messaging very clear because it wasn't somehow handed over. The information wasn't relayed to them clearly. So therefore, now there's a discrepancy between the messaging of the marketing department and what the sales team is saying to actual customers, right? So if you're constantly changing, constantly adding and revising little pivots all the time, then that means that the team has to constantly make sure that they're constantly updated with the whims and the thought patterns of the founder. So what does that mean for the founder? It means that the founder does not understand the consequences of constant changing, not calculating and strategizing the intent or the purpose of the pivot. Think about it. If you're constantly micro pivoting, it means that it's not very clear the reason why you pivoted the previous time or the time before that or the time before that. If there's so many pivots, let's just say you've pivoted, a dozen times, it means that the last 11 times wasn't well thought out, right? There's a difference between slight adjustments and constantly pivoting, which means that you're just nothing's very clear upstairs. Does that make sense? So what I've seen is that when there's constant micro pivots, the founder doesn't understand the consequences of the constant change, right? Every little pivot needs to be deployed and relayed to the entire organization so everyone's in line. If they're not in line, I guarantee that this will cause operational problems. And so, how does the founder not understand the consequences of constant changing? Well, I think it's just because they're overly hyped, overly emotional, not calculating and strategizing the actual intent and purpose of the pivot. And I'll get into more depth about this later. By the way, we have a service called Ops Direct where we help founders get clarity around their business operations. If you're interested, click the link in the description. So, back to micro pivoting. If you're constantly changing course, then how can you measure the impact of the last pivot, right? Because when you're pivoting, it just naturally takes time for you to understand whether the pivot was a successful pivot, right? If you're changing lanes, you need time for the market, for your employees, for the organization to organically understand what's going on. So if the business changes course often, then it's very difficult to measure, if not impossible to measure, if the last pivot worked, right? Because it takes time for the pivots to work. It takes time for the business owner to understand, business owner, the employees, everyone actually, to understand whether the pivot was successful. Because as you're changing these little things, changing features, changing the messaging, you want to be able to read whether that was a good decision. And if you're constantly micro pivoting, then it's impossible to calculate and see if that decision, that mini decision, was a good one. Basically, it takes time for performance to be extracted during these pivots because you are interacting between this sort of conceptual business machine, right? Capitalism and the market. There's an interaction going on, and it just takes time for you to understand whether those micro pivot was successful based on the interactions that you relay between you and the customer or you and the employee and so on. The reason why over pivoting is so dangerous is because founders mistake motion for progress. This is a really important concept. Just because there's constantly something happening and everyone's jazzed up and you're going over here and you're changing this and you're changing this and everything is it doesn't necessarily mean that you're moving in the right direction. And if we go a little bit deeper, changing direction typically means that you want something to change. Think about that. Changing direction all the time means that usually there's some sort of frustration. Not saying for every single business, but the ones that I'm thinking of. If you're changing direction all the time, it means that you want something in your current reality to change, right? You don't like the road you're currently taking. So therefore you are chasing trends, you are reactive and not strategic, right? So you go on YouTube and you've had too many glasses of wine, then all of a sudden you hear this guy on YouTube, maybe it's somebody like me who tells you something and, that's something that we need to implement tomorrow, and you get to your team. That's reactive, not strategic deployment, or it could be summed up as a micro pivot. So if you're doing this often, it's very dangerous. Okay, and the last and most abstract part of this whole topic that we're discussing today is when founders understand if over hard pivoting or overdoing any of the pivots that we mentioned before, is that it happens in hindsight. So after the fact that they've already done all these things, they realize, "Oh, crap. I shouldn't have pivoted so hard, or I shouldn't have been so reactive." So if you're an experienced founder, typically you can understand before you make these pivoting decisions that you're able to stop yourself perhaps from doing that. Okay, there's one pivot that I do want to discuss today, and that is the concept of a healthy pivot, which is a deliberate, validated, and well thought out change. Okay, so basically, it means that when you're doing a healthy pivot, it's very, very clear as to why you are doing this pivot. There's data to back it up. There's intent and purpose. It's been well thought out and well crafted in your mind. The decision has to not just feel right, but it needs to make sense. It's not just something you randomly was like, okay, and brr. No, this is well thought out. You spoke about it with the rest of your team. You've thought it out. You have reasons as to why. The intent was clear. I'm changing the messaging because my ICP is different. They prefer this messaging over that messaging. Anything that is clear and concise around the intent of the pivot, then that is a healthy pivot. Actually, if you go on YouTube and you see a video about how founder X, Y, and Z did a pivot and scaled and become a massive successes, well, that's the definition of a healthy pivot. I can almost guarantee you that it was a well thought out, well intent pivot, and right time, right place, and correct execution, and it worked well in their favor. And if you're pivoting like crazy, then check out the next video as I get into the details around how founders become their own bottleneck.